The Supermarine Spitfire, one of the most iconic aircraft from the Second World War. It was the only British fighter to see continuous production throughout the entire duration of the war, and it has a rich and varied history with over 20,000 being built. The history of this iconic machine is something I'm planning to cover in the near future, but before I do, I think it's important to discuss another series of aircraft that came before it. They were not directly related to the Spitfire, and they shared no common parts, and were built several years before its time. But their development, and the lessons learned from it, formed the basis of many of the design principles to which the Spitfire was eventually built. More importantly, these aircraft allowed for the development of highly advanced and powerful aero engines. They helped pioneer the development of new cooling systems and the use of advanced superchargers. I am, of course, talking about the Supermarine Schneider racers. These sleek, powerful, and highly innovative racing aircraft would form the basis of the Spitfire's heritage. A heritage that continues to this day, with hundreds of surviving Spitfires to be found all around the world. And it is a heritage that you can help to preserve thanks to the sponsor of today's video, REC Watches. REC produces some beautiful and unique timepieces that include unused and original parts from restoration projects. Now recently, they teamed up with the Hunter Fighter Collection, a not-for-profit organisation that is actually down here where I live in Australia, and they are working to restore a very rare Mark 1A Spitfire. Specifically, they are restoring Spitfire X4009, which was flown by Patterson Hughes, who was the highest-scoring Australian pilot during the Battle of Britain. In collaboration with this, REC have recently launched their X4009 collection, which consists of 3 gorgeous designs: Anthra Grey, Midnight Blue, and Semtra Black, and I'm eagerly awaiting my delivery of the Midnight Blue model. And with each watch, some of the original aluminium from the aircraft's fuselage, deemed unfit for restoration, has been incorporated into the watch design. I think it's a brilliant concept. You get to carry around a little piece of history, part of a Spitfire that actually flew in the Battle of Britain, and one that saw a lot of action, and you also get to support a restoration project that keeps this piece of history alive for future generations to see. Now, the X4009 collection is currently available for pre-order, with a fantastic 15% discount for pre-order purchases. But only a limited number will be available, so if you want to get your hands on a piece of this history for yourself, I recommend you hurry over to REC's website. There's a link in the description below. Now, when you purchase one of these watches, you'll get free worldwide shipping, a 36-month warranty, and if for whatever strange reason you're not completely happy, it comes with a 30-day return policy as well. So thank you REC for sponsoring today's video and helping out with X4009's restoration, something which I'm hoping to cover in a later video. And now, let's take a look at the Supermarine Schneider racers. These aircraft were designed to represent British aviation in the fiercely competitive Schneider Cup. This was an aerial competition held in the 1910s, and then the years following the First World War. Initially founded to encourage the development of civil aircraft, it quickly evolved into a contest of national pride, with the end goal being to produce the fastest seaplane in the world. Now, the detailed history of this fantastic race is one for another day, and it will get its own video in the future, don't worry about that, but today we're just going to touch on it generally, as we're mostly going to focus on Supermarine's involvement and the aircraft that came from it. These were the Supermarine S4, S5, S6, and S6B, and they would come to form the nucleus of the Spitfire's heritage. As the popularity of the Schneider races quickly grew in the early 1920s, it quickly evolved from being a simple air race into a matter of deep national pride. Following 2 years of Italian dominance, which could have been a fatal 3 if they hadn't been disqualified in 1919, Britain claimed the Schneider Trophy in 1922 with the Supermarine Sea Lion II, which was a design by Reginald Mitchell, a man who needs no introduction, but just to be safe for those who may not know who he is, of course, the famous designer of the early iterations of the Spitfire. For more information on his earlier years at the company, I recommend checking out my video that covers early Supermarine aircraft. The Sea Lion II was significantly faster than the previous year's winning design, the Italian Marquis M7 Bis. The M7 had a top speed of 117.8 miles an hour, and the Sea Lion far outpaced it at 145.7. But Britain's success was short-lived, as they were comprehensively beaten the following year in 1923 by the American-built Curtiss CR-3, which topped out at 177 miles an hour. Not only did this represent a dramatic jump in top speed, but it also represented a shift in aircraft design. All of the winning aircraft of the various races, at least since its resumption following the First World War, had thus far been flying boats. But the Curtiss had been a floatplane. This seemed to indicate the end of the flying boat's competitive dominance, but R.J. Mitchell and Supermarine weren't fully convinced yet. In late 1923, he initiated a new design project for a highly streamlined flying boat to be named the Supermarine Sea Urchin. It featured a redesigned hull, a completely new wing structure, redesigned tail surfaces, and, most importantly, the bulky engine, which produced a considerable amount of drag on previous designs, as it was mounted in between the wings, had been removed from this usual position and was now to be installed within the hull itself. This engine was to be a 600 horsepower liquid-cooled Rolls-Royce Condor. It would drive a two-blade propeller in the pusher configuration, and as this propeller was to be mounted along the chord of the upper wing, it was to be driven by shafts connected by a series of beveled gears. Though this made it a highly innovative design, the Sea Urchin would never be completed. Not only did the engine deliver less power than expected, forcing them to switch out to a Napier Lion instead, but the challenges of building a beveled gear system that was A. small enough, B. light enough, and C. strong enough proved to be far too difficult. Following the cancellation of the 1924 race, as neither Britain, France, or Italy had even bothered to submit an aircraft, leaving the US to essentially win by default, but they declared it cancelled instead, R.J. Mitchell abandoned the idea of using a flying boat for the 1925 race and went with something far more innovative. The result was the Supermarine S4. Compared to the bulky flying boats and heavily strutted biplanes of previous years, this new, sleek monoplane design looked like it was developed in a completely different era, and indeed it was considerably ahead of its time. Not only did the S4 make use of a semi-monocoque fuselage, a design feature which had been seen on earlier racers before the First World War but had disappeared from design drawings since, but the S4 also featured an unbraced cantilever wing. In the pursuit of the highest speed possible, every conceivable effort had been made to reduce drag. The specially modified Napier Lion engine, which could produce up to 700 horsepower in short bursts, was housed inside a streamlined cowl. The oil cooling unit was installed within the lower fuselage, with just the fins jutting out into the airstream, and the struts which connected to the single-step floats to the fuselage were made as thin and as aerodynamic as possible without compromising their strength. The S4 was also notable as being the first Schneider racer for Britain to receive official support from the government. They agreed to buy the completed aircraft if Supermarine was willing to initially fund its development and construction. This meant that a successful design would theoretically have its development costs written off, which would encourage the design team to be less conservative and push for more innovative ideas. This was done in response to the crushing defeat to the Americans back in 1923, who themselves had received considerable government support which was now aiding in the development of their newest racer, the Curtiss R3C2. Though the S4 set a new seaplane record in September of 1925, achieving a top speed of 226 miles an hour, or 364 kilometers an hour, it soon proved to be too innovative for its own good. During practice trials in the lead up to that year's race, the S4 suddenly lost control at high speed and was written off in a crash. The exact cause of the crash was never fully confirmed. Some suspected aileron flutter, others suggested unexpected stall characteristics at certain angles of attack. But regardless, the S4 was out of the competition, and once again the Americans won the race. Now the pressure was really on. The Schneider Cup was not simply a perpetual competition, one that would be held every year as long as people had an interest in it. It had an end goal. If a country won the race 3 years in a row, they would claim the cup permanently and be declared as the ultimate winner. By this point, the Schneider races had become exceedingly popular, attracting crowds of hundreds of thousands of people each year. Public pressure for a British victory in 1926 was incredibly strong, and this resulted in two key things, one of which would directly impact the development of the Spitfire a decade later. Firstly, R.J. Mitchell abandoned the use of the unbraced cantilever wing when designing the S5, the next racer, switching instead to a slightly less advanced, but much more stable, braced wing. This also had the benefit of producing a much thinner wing that reduced drag. And secondly, the Air Ministry stepped up its support of the racing program and established a policy of training pilots and performing extensive wind tunnel tests for all of the high-speed designs moving forward. This was significant, as although R.J. Mitchell was now focusing on the S5, he continued to also experiment with unbraced cantilever wings of various shapes and profiles. Later on, some of the data gleaned from these early experiments would aid in the development of the Spitfire's iconic elliptical wing in the mid-1930s. The intense research program carried out by the Supermarine team meant that, although it looked less innovative than the S4, the S5 would outperform it considerably. Following tests on several different models of various designs, a low-mounted wire-braced wing was considered as the best. This design not only provided the best stability across all flight conditions, but it also had the added advantage of improving visibility for the pilot, something which had been a cause of complaint with the mid-mounted wing of the S4. Additionally, whereas the S4 was built primarily from wood, the S5 utilized mixed construction. The fuselage was now built from a duralumin monocoque and utilized the latest developments in riveted metal skins. Additionally, in response to various grumblings from the years before, the S5 also featured a new scoop-shaped engine mounting, which apparently made servicing the aircraft much easier compared to its predecessor, as engineers no longer had to perform feats of dexterity, or perhaps pray silently to the machine spirit, in order to access certain parts of the engine. Other improvements included the first use of radiators mounted in the wings, which were flush with the surface to produce basically no drag, and a more powerful version of the Napier Lion. 3 S5s were to be built, using 2 different versions of this engine, all 3 driving a new style of all-metal 2-blade propeller. One used a direct-drive 900 horsepower version, which was the Lion 7A, and the others used the 7B, which was a geared version which produced 875 horsepower. Though it promised to be a marked improvement over the S4, the complexity of the S5, and that of the research program that developed it, meant that it would not be ready for the 1926 race. Owing to similar delays being faced by the Italians, attempts were made to change the frequency of the races, having them held every second year instead of it being annually. Unfortunately, attempts to postpone the race by a year was refused by the US National Aeronautical Association, who, as defending champions, were hosting the 1926 race, and had no real incentive to postpone it, as they had not been facing any development challenges themselves. And so, the British team, who could not be ready in time, had to look on with bated breath. Many expected the Curtiss planes to once again secure victory, but the Americans did not win in 1926. Instead, and this is a strange sentence to say, the British were saved by Benito Mussolini. He had decreed that Italy must win back the trophy at all costs, and they did just that with the Macchi M39. This essentially reset the competition, and it revived interest in the races when many believed America had the win all but totally secured. In consequence of this, and with a chance for victory once again restored, Britain would enter 3 different aircraft models for the 1927 race: the Gloster 4, the Short Crusader, and the Supermarine S5. In its final configuration for the race, the S5 featured a few minor changes from the original design. The tailplane incidents had been adjusted, as previously it was found to be a bit on the nose-heavy side and expressed a tendency to convert itself into an impromptu submarine at certain speeds on the water. The struts connecting the floats had been reinforced, as there had been an alarming risk of them bending on impact with said water, and a new ventilation system was installed in the cockpit, a consequence of an early flight test which almost resulted in the fumigation of one Flight Lieutenant O.E. Worsley. The 3 improved S5s were shipped out to Venice for the 1927 race, the Italians being the host as the previous year's victors, where they were joined by 5 other British entries. This formed the single largest group to ever be entered by any country, and it highlighted Britain's eagerness to achieve victory. And achieve victory it did. In what amounted to a competition of Britain versus Italy, with America pulling out, Britain won hands down. All of the Italian entries retired due to mechanical problems, and 2 of the S5s completed a 1-2 finish, with the fastest clocking in an average top speed of 281 miles an hour, or 453 kilometers an hour. Following this race, and owing to the ever-increasing complexity of the racing aircraft being designed, it was finally agreed that the race should be held biennially instead, with the next slated for 1929. Once again, the S5 would find itself being entered in a modified format, but it would be joined by the new Supermarine S6. This design took everything that was good about the S5 and improved it even further. This time, R.J. Mitchell went with an all-metal design, refining the airframe and smoothing down its lines to further improve its aerodynamic properties. Physically, the S6 was larger and heavier than its predecessor, with a gross weight of 5,700 pounds, or around 2,600 kilos, versus just 3,200 pounds, or 1,470 kilos of the old S5. But this dramatic increase in weight was offset by an even bigger increase in power. The Napier Lion had powered the S4 and S5 to victory, proving to be a remarkably reliable and effective engine compared with the competition. But by this point its development had more or less peaked, and not much more power could be squeezed out of its design. Rumours were beginning to spread of some very powerful designs being tested by Fiat over in Italy, and, eager to see Britain win again, Sir Henry Royce of Rolls-Royce offered to build an experimental racing version of the Rolls-Royce Buzzard. In a meeting with R.J. Mitchell, he guaranteed that he could get the engine to develop at least 1,500 horsepower. R.J. Mitchell agreed to his offer, and work began on what would become known as the Rolls-Royce R, the R standing for racing. What followed was an intense period of ground testing at the Rolls-Royce factory at Derby, during which Rolls-Royce received numerous public complaints about noise levels, where the people of Derby were quite literally stuffing their ears with cotton or wax. It got so bad that the people actually appealed to the mayor of Derby himself. But the mayor turned around and told them to basically suck it up, as British pride was on the line, and they needed Rolls-Royce to finish developing their engine, no matter how loud it was, and no matter how many times it tried to explode. Rolls-Royce was beginning to deliver the power that was required for this new racing aircraft, but there was the question of endurance. 1,500 horsepower was finally achieved, but the engine ran for about 10 minutes. A few weeks later it was running for 20 minutes, then 30 minutes, then 45 minutes, and finally they got it running reliably for more than an hour. When the first of these non-exploding engines was handed over to the Supermarine team, R.J. Mitchell had good reasons to be pleased. Royce's original guarantee of 1,500 horsepower had been met and exceeded, and the S6 was now powered by a 37-litre, 1,900 horsepower monster, making it more than twice as powerful as the previous S5. The key to the R engine's raw power was the use of specially mixed fuels combined with an advanced supercharger, allowing it to supply air at up to 1.24 bar, which was a threefold increase over previous supercharger capabilities. This would not only benefit the S6 in the upcoming race, but Rolls-Royce would also apply much of the lessons learned in developing the R-engine when they began development work on the PV12, which of course became the Rolls-Royce Merlin. Now, running such a high-powered engine did present something of a challenge when it came to cooling systems, because you were suddenly generating a lot more heat. Obviously, a stonking great big radiator would ruin the aircraft's lines, so RJ Mitchell had to get inventive with the use of surface radiators. Surface radiators were installed in the wings, like on the S5, but they were considerably larger, forming an integral part of the wing's internal structure. Additionally, surface radiators were also built into the floats, and the tail fin doubled as an oil cooler and as an auxiliary oil tank. All of this required a considerable amount of plumbing to be installed, particularly to pump the engine oil from the nose to the tail fin and then back again, but the power output of the R-engine was so good that the S6 still had a power-to-weight ratio advantage of more than 14%. Now, so much power did also continue to raise the issue of engine life. Rolls-Royce could get the engine to run for more than an hour, but they needed regular servicing to prevent catastrophic failure. And indeed, the S6's Certificate of Airworthiness came with a special clause that limited them to just 5 hours of engine running time between overhauls. This included ground running, and this meant that the engines were perpetually going to and fro between Derby and the training area at Culshot. To speed things up, a specially modified Rolls-Royce Phantom was used as a transport to take the engines to and fro from the factory, and the staff soon got into something of a private competition to see who could make the trip between Culshot and Derby the fastest. Apparently, one of them was caught driving said Rolls-Royce, carrying the massive R-engine in the back, doing speeds of over 80 miles an hour through a sleepy Hampshire village at about 2 AM in the morning, with the police not actually catching up until it reached its destination. I'm still unsure if that is a testament to the utter stones of the person driving the Phantom, or the capability of the Phantom itself. While the engineers of Rolls-Royce were completing the 1930s equivalent of a Top Gear challenge, RAF pilots were busy putting the S6 through its paces in a series of practice trials. Initially, they struggled to even get the S6 into the air, as the engine torque was so strong that it would drive the port float into the sea, and the S6 would flounder around in undignified circles. Eventually, this was fixed by putting most of the fuel in the opposite float, taking off at a 40-degree angle to the wind, and with a violent application of force to the rudder. Eventually, 2 S6s were prepared for the race, along with the S5 after Gloucester was forced to withdraw its own aircraft, and the date was set for September 7th, 1929. Supermarine and Rolls-Royce won the race by a considerable margin. The winning S6, flown by Flying Officer Richard Waghorn, completed the race at an average speed of 328 miles an hour, or 528 kilometers an hour. This was considerably faster than the competing Macchi M52R, which only achieved 282 miles an hour. The 1929 victory meant that Britain only had to win again in 1931 to claim the Schneider Cup for good. At a celebration dinner, Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald pledged the government's full support, saying that we are going to do our level best to win again. Considering this verbal promise, it's somewhat understandable that the British public was a little shocked when government support for the race was withdrawn just a few weeks later. Hugh Trenchard, then the Marshal of the RAF, believed that any further involvement would bring little value. The RAF had already collected a lot of data on the development of high-speed aircraft from the Supermarine S5 and S6, and the rapidly mounting development costs were deemed to outweigh any future benefits. With the withdrawal of government support, Britain's entry into the 1931 race would have to be a wholly private enterprise. This meant that new pilots would have to be found, as the RAF refused to supply their own officers, and Supermarine would have to raise funds for the development of a new racer. This also meant that the hosting of the event would have to be privately funded as well, as previously the RAF had supplied funds for the Royal Aero Club. This resulted in a considerable amount of public and political backlash. In a paradoxical twist, the Conservative opposition constantly harassed the Labour government, urging that state intervention, no matter the cost, was required. Soon, the press joined in on the collective dogpile of the administration, as did various aero clubs, but the government dug in its heels. The RAF had learned all that it required about high-speed aircraft during 1927 and 1929, and in the new economic climate following the Wall Street crash, it could not justify the expenditure of public funds. Now, as logical as that answer was, national pride was on the line, and many people found this decision was completely intolerable. This mood strengthened when Italy and France formally announced their entries into the race, with both of their teams being government-sponsored. And very soon, various British newspapers initiated a patriotic campaign to raise enough funds so that Britain could defend the Schneider Trophy. One of these newspapers found its way into the hands of Lady Lucy Houston, philanthropist, suffragist, and, to her credit, one of the most successful fortune hunters of her time. By this point, she was one of the richest women in the country, and despite being aged 75, she was still very much politically active. From a strong desire to both see Britain succeed in the race, and to blear the eye of the current administration which she utterly despised, Lady Houston immediately, and very publicly, donated a grand sum of £100,000. This gesture had its desired effects. Not only did it provide Supermarine with enough funds to enter into the race, but it increased public animosity to such a pitch that the government had no choice but to pledge its support as well. The RAF would supply pilots and its resources so that Britain should win the Cup in 1931 at all costs. Unfortunately, all this drama dragged on for so long that there was little more than 9 months left to develop a new racing aircraft. With this daunting task ahead of them, R.J. Mitchell's team, and Rolls-Royce, agreed that it would be better to refine the existing S6 rather than to attempt to build a new design from scratch. 2 new aircraft would be built, designated as the S6B, and the 2 existing S6s would also be brought up to the same specification. The plan was to enter 2 into the race, with the other pair being held in reserve. Like with the original plan of the S6, the main design goal of the S6B was an increase in power. Rolls-Royce set out to increase the output of the R engine by 25%, and R.J. Mitchell got to work on cleaning up the aircraft's lines to further reduce drag, and on improving the cooling systems. The S6B itself was not a revolutionary design, in the same way that its predecessors were, but through many refinements it came to represent the pinnacle of British aviation in the early 1930s. Rolls-Royce had delivered on their promise. Their engine now produced a massive 2,300 horsepower at 3,200 RPM, and it could reliably do so at this output for well over an hour at a time. To cope with the increased torque, and the considerably higher expected airspeeds, the airframe was significantly reinforced, and the number of sections built into the monocoque of the fuselage was increased by approximately 30%. Additionally, the fuel tankage was increased, owing to higher fuel consumption, as was the complexity of the cooling system, as the engine now also generated considerably more heat. The surface radiators in the wings were expanded and made more efficient, and the radiators on the floats now covered almost every square inch that was exposed to the air. Indeed, the complexity of the cooling system led to the aircraft being nicknamed the Flying Radiator by some of the engineers, a name which caught on. The added weight of the beefed-up cooling system, which included over 100 feet of plumbing, increased the total weight by about 10%, bringing the total gross weight up to just over 6,000 pounds, or 2.7 tons. But that did little to offset the combined performance gains expected from the increased engine power and the smoothed-out lines of the airframe. Because of this, the S6B was predicted to achieve speeds in excess of 340 miles an hour. In the event, the S6B would in fact do considerably better than this, but as for the Schneider Trophy itself, the race was something of an anticlimax. It was meant to be a three-way competition, with Britain versus Italy and France, who had not made a serious entry for many years. But in the days leading up to the race, which was to be held on September the 12th, though this was delayed until the 13th owing to bad weather, both the French and the Italian teams would withdraw from the competition. They were both suffering from reliability problems with their engines, and both of the racing teams were reeling from fatal accidents during training flights. The loss of the Italian entry, the Macchi Castoldi MC72, was particularly disappointing. It was driven by a massive 2,500 horsepower 24-cylinder Fiat AS6, and during trial runs, it had clocked in an airspeed of 375 miles an hour, or just over 600 kilometers an hour. This made it a serious rival for Supermarine, and many people were eagerly looking forward to a high-powered aerial showdown between Britain and Italy. But alas, it was not to be. Instead, Flight Lieutenant John Boothman took off in his S6B and completed the race uncontested, attaining an average speed of 340 miles an hour. This speed was considerably lower than expected, owing to problems with water cooling, but the cheering crowd didn't care. Britain had just secured permanent victory in the Schneider Cup races, and that is all they cared about. Just over a fortnight later, the S6B's performance was fully realised when it set a new speed record. On the 29th of September, Flight Lieutenant G. Stainforth would take it up to 407.5 miles an hour, or 655 kilometers an hour, making it the first aircraft to break through the 400-mile-an-hour barrier. As a side note, it would only hold on to this record for just under 2 years. Though it had been pulled out due to reliability issues, the MC-72 indeed proved to be a very potent machine. It eventually set an airspeed record of 440 miles an hour, and it's an airspeed record for seaplanes that it still holds to this day. But getting back to the S6, its success had solidified the reputation of R.J. Mitchell and Supermarine as first-class designers of performance aircraft, and it provided Rolls-Royce with inestimable experience in developing high-powered engines. It also helped to build a strong working relationship between Supermarine and Rolls-Royce, something that contributed greatly to the development of the Spitfire, which would fly just 5 years later. The Spitfire was not in any shape or form directly developed from the design of the Schneider racers, as mentioned earlier, but their importance in influencing its design is without question. Following the failure of the Supermarine 224, R.J. Mitchell's first attempt at producing a new high-speed fighter for the RAF, and something that we will cover in the in-depth Spitfire videos, the team began working on a more refined design to replace it. There, the influence of the Schneider racers could be easily seen. In many ways, the prototype Spitfire looked like a land-plane version of a Schneider racer, though, as mentioned before, there is no direct connection between them. But the biggest influence was not found in the airframe, instead it was found in the engine. One of the causes for the failure of the Supermarine 224 was the Rolls-Royce Goshawk, which used steam cooling and suffered from a lot of reliability problems. But Rolls-Royce had also been working on another engine, the PV-12. This was larger than their Kestrel engine, smaller than the old Buzzard engine, but more powerful than both. It utilised many of the advances made with the R engines of the Schneider races, along with the related advancements made in supercharger development, and the result was the Rolls-Royce Merlin. This was the engine that would not only power many versions of the Supermarine Spitfire, but also the Hawker Hurricane, the de Havilland Mosquito, the Handley Page Halifax, and the Avro Lancaster, just to name a few. That is the true legacy of the Supermarine Schneider racers. Not just the Spitfire itself, but more specifically the engine that powered it. But there are, of course, many other developments that came from the great series of races that ran from the 1910s until 1931. It wasn't just British aviation that benefited. The fierce desire to win drove innovation within all nations who competed, particularly Italy. and that is something that will be covered in an in-depth planned video series that will cover the Schneider Cup from start to finish. But that is a topic for another day. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters. Now, I'm currently away up in tropical Queensland at the moment, so I'm unable to update this list, as I'm busy sweating, but I will do so as soon as I get back down into my office. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier members, and just a heads up for the rest of this month, there probably won't be too many other videos going up, maybe another 1 or 2, until I return back home in early October. But hopefully the schedule in October will be a bit more regular. But, as always, thank you all for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.